They said I didn't belong here. The glass doors of the Diamond Elite Lounge gleamed like a fortress, and I was the intruder. Champagne dripped down my suit as laughter echoed around me, their words cutting sharper than broken glass. VIP is for real important people. What they didn't know, what no one in that room could imagine, was that every insult was a countdown. I wasn't just another passenger. Behind my silence hid a power they could never predict. And when the truth struck, it wouldn't just change this lounge, it would shake the entire system. The sliding glass doors of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport opened with a whoosh, spilling Naomi Carter into the bright chaos of departing travelers. Her hair was tied back neatly, her navy suit pressed, her stride steady. Yet she walked not as Naomi Carter, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar biotech empire and daughter of the Secretary of Defense, but as Naomi Griffin, the name printed on her ticket and her ID. She had learned early that sometimes anonymity was safer than fame, especially when that fame carried with it the weight of both admiration and resentment. The check-in counters stretched in an endless line. Naomi blended in with the morning crowd of business travelers, many of them men in tailored suits clutching leather briefcases, their expressions sharp with the impatience of people who had never been denied access to anything in their lives. She carried only a modest handbag and a boarding pass already tucked neatly between her fingers. Her security aide, Michael Ross, hovered a step behind, his eyes scanning constantly, though to the casual observer he appeared nothing more than a colleague. Naomi's gaze settled on the first-class line. She joined it quietly, waiting her turn, her presence unremarkable among the throng. The woman at the counter, Bethany Carter, her name stitched neatly on a badge, looked up briefly. She was blonde, in her 30s, her lips pressed into a line that curved not from professionalism but from a practiced superiority. "Next," Bethany called, her eyes already falling back to the screen. Naomi stepped forward and placed her ID and boarding pass on the counter with a calm smile. "Washington, D.C., Flight 1770, she said. Bethany glanced at the documents. For a heartbeat, her face was blank. Then something shifted, her brows arched. She lifted the ID, holding it against the light. She turned it front and back, squinting as though searching for flaws. "Full price?" Bethany asked. Her tone clipped, the question more accusation than inquiry. "Yes," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "Purchased through your airline's official website." Bethany's lips twitched. "Unusual. These premium tickets are—" She paused, her eyes flicking from the photo on the ID to Naomi's face. "Typically purchased by certain clientele, employees, executives. Not—" Her words trailed off, but the weight of what she hadn't said pressed into the air like humidity. Behind Naomi, Michael stiffened, his jaw tightening. Naomi gave the subtlest shake of her head, signaling him to stay silent. Bethany set the ID down flat on the counter, but didn't release it. "In this photo," she said, her tone heavy with doubt, "the hair looks different. Are you sure this is you?" Naomi inhaled slowly. Her voice remained calm. "Yes, I'm quite sure." The line behind her shuffled, passengers shifting their weight, some whispering. A man in a gray suit muttered loud enough for her to hear. "Always trying to scam their way into upgrades." Bethany's fingers drummed against the counter. "One moment." She turned to her colleagues, speaking in a voice intentionally just above a whisper. "Another one, third, this week." Naomi heard it. She was meant to hear it. Michael's hand curled into a fist at his side. Naomi reached back slightly, her fingertips brushing his arm, steadying him. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Dignity isn't for sale, Naomi. Not even when they try to buy it with disrespect." At last, Bethany shoved the documents back across the counter. "Gate 26B, boarding shortly." Naomi accepted them with the same calm smile. "Thank you." But the sting lingered. The knot in her chest was one she knew too well, one built over years of moments just like this. She and Michael moved toward the first-class gate. The lounge entrance loomed ahead. Sleek glass doors, polished silver handles, and a hostess stationed like a sentry. Inside, passengers reclined in plush chairs, sipping champagne, their laughter muffled by the soundproofing glass. Naomi approached, boarding pass in hand. The hostess, Meredith Hall, smiled wide at the man ahead of her, a balding executive type in a silk tie. "Welcome back, Mr. Peterson. Your usual seat is waiting." When it was Naomi's turn, Meredith's smile dimmed several watts. Her eyes traveled from Naomi's face to her modest handbag, down to the sensible shoes. The warmth vanished, replaced by a professional chill. "Membership card?" Meredith asked. Naomi offered her boarding pass. "First class, flight 1770. The captain announced first-class passengers would have lounge access during the delay." Meredith examined the pass as though Naomi had handed her counterfeit currency. "Yes, for Diamond Elite members. This ticket alone isn't sufficient." Michael shifted forward. "The announcement said—" Naomi placed a hand on his arm. "It's fine," she said softly. She turned back to Meredith. "I wasn't informed of any requirement beyond first-class status." Meredith's smile thinned. "Perhaps you misunderstood." The words landed sharp, deliberate. Misunderstood. As if Naomi's education, her intellect, her life's work meant nothing here. Inside the lounge, laughter rose as a server passed with a tray of champagne. One glass tilted, golden liquid shimmering as it caught the light. The hand that tipped it belonged to Robert Harrington, his cufflinks gleaming, his expression smug. "Oh," Robert said as the champagne spilled in a graceful arc before crashing across Naomi's chest. The cold seeped instantly through the fabric of her suit. Her breath caught. The sting wasn't just physical. It was humiliation layered thick as the liquid that drenched her. Robert's smirk lingered. "Clumsy me," he said, his emphasis on me carrying no real apology. Around them, a ripple of laughter ran through the room. Passengers hiding smiles behind hands, shaking heads in performative disapproval that didn't mask their amusement. Meredith reached beneath the counter and produced a single napkin. She extended it across the space as if presenting a peace offering. "Perhaps you'd like to change before your flight," she suggested sweetly. "The public restrooms are just down the concourse." Naomi stood frozen, her body cold, her pride colder still. The champagne dripped down her sleeve, staining the cuff. Her gaze swept the room, faces watching, some openly entertained, others pretending not to notice, none stepping forward. Michael's jaw flexed, his hand sliding toward the inside of his jacket. Naomi's sharp glance stopped him. "It's just a suit," she murmured, though her voice trembled under the weight of suppressed fire. Robert adjusted his cufflinks with a smirk. "VIP is for real important people," he said, his voice pitched perfectly to carry across the lounge. The words echoed, sealing the humiliation. Naomi's spine straightened. She forced her breathing steady. The temptation to reveal herself, to end this charade with a single sentence pressed at her lips. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she turned slightly, meeting Michael's furious gaze. "Wait," she whispered. "Let them keep digging." The room's laughter still echoed when Naomi stepped back from the counter, her suit heavy with champagne, her silence heavier still. She would endure this moment, as she had endured 1,000 others. But endurance was never weakness. It was preparation. And while they believed they had stripped her dignity, they had only set the stage. The countdown had begun. The champagne still clung to Naomi's suit as she stepped away from the counter, but her mind drifted somewhere else, somewhere far behind the gleaming glass and polished floors of the airport lounge. It drifted back to the cracked sidewalks of Southwest Atlanta, to the neighborhood where she grew up. The smell of fried chicken from corner stores, the sound of sirens that never seemed too far away, the soft voice of her mother whispering prayers late into the night after double shifts as a nurse's aide. Naomi Carter had been born into a world that expected little of her. Her mother, Angela Griffin, worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, while her father, when he appeared at all, was more shadow than presence. Naomi learned early that the world measured her not by her dreams, but by the weight of stereotypes. Teachers spoke slowly to her as though her dark skin meant slower comprehension. Shopkeepers watched her every move, waiting for a theft that never came. Yet Naomi had a mind that refused to bend. At 8, she was dismantling radios just to rebuild them. At 12, she was tutoring seniors in algebra. By 14, she had read medical journals most adults couldn't pronounce. Her mother would smile through tired eyes and say, "Baby, the world will try to tell you no 1,000 times, but you only need one yes, and you can change everything." The yes came in the form of a full scholarship to Harvard University. Naomi walked onto campus at 17, surrounded by wealth and privilege that dwarfed anything she had known. Her classmates wore designer coats and carried trust funds. She carried a second-hand laptop and the weight of expectation. Some professors dismissed her as a diversity admit. Peers looked past her as though she were invisible. But invisibility had its advantages. While they ignored her, she studied them. How they spoke, how they moved, how they wielded influence. She mastered not just the science she studied, but the language of power itself. From Harvard, she leapt to MIT, diving into biomedical engineering. There, in the quiet glow of lab equipment, Naomi found her calling, merging artificial intelligence with medical diagnostics. By the time she was 23, her algorithms were detecting tumors in brain scans with higher accuracy than seasoned specialists. At Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, she pushed further, earning her MD in neurosurgery while simultaneously publishing breakthroughs that drew whispers in academic circles. Some dismissed her work as theoretical. Others scoffed that she was too young, too ambitious. Naomi absorbed every doubt and used it as fuel. Then came the night that would shift her trajectory forever. She was 28, a resident on an exhausting overnight shift, when the sirens screamed into the emergency bay. A car crash. A young man, unconscious, skull fractured, bleeding into his brain. The odds were slim. Naomi scrubbed in without hesitation, her hands steady despite her pounding heart. Hours passed. By dawn, the boy's life had been pulled back from the edge. Naomi left the OR drenched in sweat, her body aching, but alive with triumph. Only later did she learn whose son he was. The only child of Senator William Harrington, one of the most powerful men on Capitol Hill. He had stormed into the hospital at 3 a.m., demanding answers, only to be told that a young resident named Naomi Carter had saved his boy. Senator Harrington had tried to arrange a press conference to parade her as the miracle worker. Naomi refused. "The patient's dignity matters more than mine," she said. Instead, she asked for nothing but additional funding for the neurosurgery department. The senator, stunned by her refusal of fame, never forgot. Quietly, he began to follow her career, doors opening that otherwise would have stayed bolted shut. By 31, Naomi had founded Ceravita, a biotech company merging AI with personalized medicine. Investors scoffed at first, until her algorithms began predicting treatment outcomes with near-perfect accuracy. Within 2 years, Ceravita was valued in the billions, and Naomi was hailed in industry journals as a prodigy, a disruptor, a once-in-a-generation mind. But outside the glossy magazine covers, reality was harsher. At conferences, she was mistaken for an assistant. At board meetings, men twice her age asked if she was the marketing girl. Even now, standing in the airport soaked in champagne, she was treated as though she didn't belong. That was the irony Naomi had come to accept. No matter how high she climbed, the world found new ways to drag her down. Yet every insult only sharpened her resolve. Michael, her aide, leaned close as they walked away from the lounge doors. "You shouldn't have to endure this," he muttered. Naomi gave a faint smile. "I've endured worse. They think I'm powerless. That's the mistake they always make." She remembered another moment, one she had never shared publicly. A closed-door meeting at the Pentagon 2 months earlier. Generals, advisors, defense contractors, most in their 50s and 60s, had filled the room. Naomi had been the youngest by decades, the only black woman in sight. They had invited her because Ceravita's AI had applications in military medicine, triage, and soldier recovery. The room had been skeptical, even hostile, until Naomi projected her algorithms on the wall and demonstrated how her model could predict battlefield survival rates with 94% accuracy. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the murmured word from a 4-star general. Revolutionary. From that day, Naomi was no longer just a biotech CEO. She was a quiet partner of the Department of Defense, her influence spreading deeper than most could imagine. Her badge, the one Bethany had nearly glimpsed, was more than a corporate ID. It was a key to rooms where policy and power converged. Yet in this airport lounge, drenched in champagne, none of that mattered. Not yet. Naomi adjusted her wet sleeve, her mind returning to the present. She looked across the glass doors at the passengers laughing inside, oblivious to the story they were writing for themselves, the story of their arrogance. "They think you're just another traveler," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. Naomi's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained calm. "Good, let them." Her thoughts swirled, not with shame, but with calculation. Every humiliation stacked upon the last, every insult etched deeper into memory. They thought they had diminished her, reduced her to nothing more than an outsider with a spoiled suit. But they were wrong. The truth was, Naomi Carter had never been just another passenger. She was a storm contained, a blade sheathed, a name that carried whispers in the highest corridors of power. And when the moment came, when the truth could no longer stay hidden, it would not be she who felt small. It would be everyone who had laughed. The lounge's glass doors slid open with a soft hiss as another wave of first-class passengers strolled inside, laughter echoing from polished marble floors and cushioned leather seats. Naomi stood just outside, her suit still stained with champagne, her boarding pass gripped lightly between her fingers. She had been told to wait, though the word itself carried no weight. It wasn't about a delay. It was about denial. The lounge manager, Taylor Brooks, appeared from the interior, a tall man in his 40s, dressed in a sleek navy vest and silver tie that gleamed like armor. His posture was one of ownership, chin lifted slightly higher than necessary, shoulders squared as though he commanded an army of hospitality. His smile was practiced, but it was not for her. "Ms. Griffin, is it?" he asked, glancing briefly at the boarding pass without making true eye contact. His voice was polished, polite on the surface, but sharpened beneath with something colder. "Yes," Naomi said calmly. "First-class ticket, flight 1770. Taylor clasped his hands behind his back, the gesture that suggested patience with a child rather than respect for a guest. "We've reviewed your documents. Unfortunately, the Diamond Elite Lounge has certain standards to uphold. Entry is reserved for our most distinguished passengers, those who represent the image of the airline." The word standard landed like a blade, thinly veiled, but deliberate. Naomi raised an eyebrow, her face betraying no anger. "The policy states first-class passengers are granted lounge access." Taylor's smile thinned. "Yes, though in practice, we must consider the experience of our core clientele. Comfort, environment, brand image. We must keep the standard." The pause before the final phrase was deliberate. His eyes flicked to Naomi's stained suit, then to the simple handbag she carried. He didn't have to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. You are not the standard. Behind her, Michael's jaw tightened. His hand shifted slightly toward his jacket, a reflexive move that Naomi caught from the corner of her eye. She gave him the faintest shake of her head. Inside the lounge, the man responsible for her champagne-soaked suit, Robert Harrington, leaned casually against a leather chair, his champagne flute refilled, his smirk unbroken. His voice cut through the air with a sharpness designed to reach Naomi's ears. "People like her lower the value of this lounge," Robert said, tilting his glass as though in a toast. The chuckle that followed was echoed by two men beside him, both nodding in silent agreement. The words rippled across the room, drawing glances, some sympathetic, many indifferent. No one intervened. The silence of complicity was louder than Robert's mockery. Naomi felt the sting, but her face remained a mask of composure. Years of boardroom battles and political backrooms had taught her restraint. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Michael leaned closer, his voice low, tight with fury. "Say the word, Naomi, and this ends. Now!" Her gaze flicked toward Taylor, whose smile was now a weapon. Toward Robert, basking in the smug glow of his insult. And finally toward the onlookers, people who would never remember the truth but would relish the spectacle. Naomi's lips barely moved as she whispered to Michael, "Wait, they're digging their own grave." The words were soft enough that only he heard them, but their weight struck him like thunder. Michael straightened, swallowing his anger, his eyes scanning the room now not with frustration but with calculation. The tension in the lounge thickened. Taylor cleared his throat, as if to dismiss Naomi entirely. "Ms. Griffin, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the public seating area near Gate 26B. Spacious, plenty of chairs. A more suitable environment." A few chuckles rose from nearby passengers, their eyes avoiding Naomi's, but their enjoyment unmistakable. Robert raised his glass again, adding mock sweetness to his tone. "Yes, dear, the public area might be more your speed. No standards to worry about there." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. His entire body screamed for action, for a confrontation that Naomi refused to grant. But Naomi stood still, her spine straight, her eyes calm. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply let the humiliation hang in the air, thick and undeniable, for everyone to witness. That silence unsettled Taylor more than any shouted demand could have. He shifted slightly, his polished demeanor flickering. He had expected outrage, anger, perhaps even tears. What he received instead was the unshakable calm of a woman who knew more than she revealed. Robert, emboldened by what he mistook for submission, leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying again. "Honestly, it's laughable. These airlines should tighten their criteria. Money isn't enough anymore. You need pedigree, presence, the right background." His gaze lingered on Naomi as he spoke the last word, his meaning unmistakable. A murmur of agreement trickled through the room. No one challenged him. Naomi was alone, isolated in plain sight. And yet, in her silence, there was a spark, too faint for the crowd to see. But Michael recognized it. The same spark he had seen in Pentagon briefings when generals doubted her algorithms. The same spark in boardrooms when investors called her ideas impossible. Naomi's silence was not surrender. It was the tightening of a bowstring. The crowd saw only a woman denied, insulted, diminished. The audience watching her story unfold felt the sting, their outrage swelling, their hearts screaming the words she refused to say. Why isn't she fighting back? But Naomi understood something the lounge did not. She understood that some battles were not worth fighting in the open, that sometimes power was most devastating when revealed at the moment of choice, not at the moment of provocation. Michael leaned close again, unable to contain the question burning in his chest. Why let them do this? Why let them humiliate you? Naomi's eyes never left Taylor's, her voice a whisper only Michael could hear. Because every insult is another brick in the wall they're building, and when it falls, it'll bury them, not me. The clock above the gate ticked softly, its hands inching forward, each second pulling the tension tighter. The champagne stain on Naomi's suit had dried, its mark still visible, a scar in fabric, a symbol of the scar they thought they had carved into her dignity. But Naomi's silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence before thunder. And as the lounge settled back into its polished comfort, as Robert lifted his glass again, as Taylor adjusted his tie in quiet triumph, Naomi Carter waited. Not in weakness, in certainty. The tension in the lounge was so thick it seemed to hum against the glass walls. Naomi stood unmoving, her boarding pass still between her fingers, her suit marked by a dried champagne stain that had become more than fabric damage. It was a silent badge of humiliation, yet her face betrayed nothing. Calm, composed, waiting. Michael shifted at her side, his hand brushing against her handbag as though by accident. But in truth, it was instinct, protective, searching. Naomi reached for the bag at the same time, intending to retrieve a tissue, if only to dab the sticky residue on her sleeve. Her fingers dipped into the side pocket, brushing against something smooth and metallic. And then it slipped. A badge, sleek and rectangular, clattered onto the polished floor with a sound far louder than it should have been in the hushed lounge. The small object spun once, catching the bright overhead lights, before coming to rest at Robert Harrington's feet. The logo gleamed in plain sight, the Pentagon, etched in sharp silver lines against a black background. Below it, the faint lettering, Department of Defense, Strategic Medical Liaison. For a heartbeat, the lounge froze. Robert's smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed as he bent slightly, peering at the badge. A flicker of confusion rippled across his face, chased quickly by disbelief. Behind the counter, Taylor Brooks had seen it too. His carefully practiced smile cracked, replaced by something raw and unsettled. His eyes darted from the badge to Naomi, and in that split second, fear surfaced. Brief, unguarded, undeniable. Naomi bent gracefully, retrieving the badge before Robert's fingers could reach it. She slipped it back into her bag with a movement so fluid it looked almost rehearsed. Her face never changed. "Just a misplaced work ID," she said softly, her voice carrying only enough for Michael to hear. But others had noticed. A woman seated nearby leaned toward her companion, whispering with urgency. A man in a business suit stole a second glance at Naomi, his brow furrowed as if suddenly recognizing a face from a news article he couldn't quite recall. The ripple spread like electricity. Heads turned, eyes lingered. The badge's brief appearance had unsettled the carefully cultivated hierarchy of the lounge. Michael leaned closer, his whisper low and taut. "They saw it." Naomi's expression remained still, her gaze steady on the glass doors ahead. "Let them wonder," she murmured. For a moment, the balance seemed ready to tip. Respect hovered in the air, waiting to be claimed. Some passengers hesitated, as if reconsidering their earlier judgments. Even Robert's smug certainty wavered, his grip on the champagne flute tightening. But then Taylor straightened, his voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his polished composure returning like armor, "we do apologize for the disruption." His eyes flicked to Naomi with calculated disdain. "Some individuals attempt to use props, shall we say, to create an illusion of status. Please rest assured that access to the Diamond Elite Lounge remains restricted to those who meet our criteria." The implication was dagger sharp. Naomi said nothing. She only met his gaze, her silence deeper than denial, her calm more dangerous than outrage. Robert seized the moment, his arrogance rekindled. "A badge?" he scoffed loudly. "From a souvenir shop, perhaps. People will go to great lengths for attention. Imagine carrying around fake Pentagon toys just to bluff your way into places you don't belong." A laugh rippled from a small cluster of passengers, eager to align themselves with Robert's authority. The ripple of doubt that had spread moments earlier began to fade, replaced once again by the easy comfort of mockery. Michael's jaw tightened until his teeth ground audibly. He leaned in, his voice barely controlled. "Naomi, enough! End this! Right here, right now!" Naomi's eyes slid toward him, her calm unshaken. "Not yet," she whispered. "They're not done revealing themselves." Her restraint baffled him. To Michael, this was already too much disrespect, too much humiliation for someone who had saved senators' children, outsmarted generals, built empires from nothing. But Naomi saw what he could not. The pattern. Each insult, each denial, each sneer was another stone in the wall they were building. And when the wall collapsed, it would fall heavier for its height. Taylor leaned forward across the counter now, his voice low but audible. "Ms. Griffin, I must insist. This lounge is not the place for you. Please collect your belongings and make your way to the public seating area." Robert raised his glass once more, the champagne catching the light. "Yes," he added smoothly. "Standards must be kept. It's only fair to those of us who actually belong here." The word belong carried centuries of weight, its blade honed by generations. Naomi's silence stretched, taut as wire. The audience of the moment, every passenger watching, every whisperer, every smirker, waited for her to break, to falter, to leave. But she did not move. Her posture remained perfect, her face unreadable, her voice absent. The effect was unnerving. Taylor's eyes flicked away, then back. Robert's smirk faltered again, if only for a second. Yet instead of offering respect, the two men doubled down. The badge, the momentary glimpse of truth, it had not humbled them. It had only made them more determined to crush her, and that was the twist. Naomi had not been elevated by the glimpse of her power. She had been pushed lower, cast as a liar, an imposter, a pretender trying to play above her station. Michael whispered harshly, "They should be kneeling, Naomi, not spitting on your name." Her lips curved the faintest degree, not in humor, but in certainty. "They will," she murmured, "but not yet." The lounge exhaled collectively as the tension thinned into cruel laughter again. Passengers relaxed, convinced the badge was nothing, the woman nothing, the moment nothing. Only Naomi knew the truth. The countdown continued. The air in the lounge was thick with self-satisfaction. Robert Harrington leaned back in his leather chair, sipping champagne as though he had personally defended the sanctity of the Diamond Elite. Taylor Brooks adjusted his tie, reassured by his own authority. The passengers returned to their hushed conversations, their laughter carrying the smug confidence that the natural order had been preserved. But Naomi Carter stood still, her silence cutting through the murmur like a blade no one dared acknowledge. Then, slowly, she reached into her handbag. The motion was small, deliberate. From within she drew a slim black phone, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but its matte finish and lack of branding marked it as something beyond consumer use. Michael, watching closely, recognized it instantly. He had seen her use it only once before, during a closed-door session at the Pentagon. Naomi's fingers glided across the screen, typing a message so brief it seemed almost careless. "It's happening. Stand by." She pressed send. The phone vibrated once in confirmation. Then she slipped it back into her bag with the same calm detachment as if she had been checking the weather. Michael inhaled sharply. "Naomi." "Patience," she murmured, her gaze never leaving the glass doors of the lounge. No one else had noticed the phone, the message, the shift in atmosphere. To the crowd, she was simply a humiliated woman still standing stubbornly where she wasn't wanted. But Michael felt the weight of that single line radiate through the room like silent thunder. He knew it wasn't just a text. It was a trigger, a signal. Somewhere, someone important was now alert, watching, waiting for Naomi's word. And yet Naomi did nothing more. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't confront Taylor or Robert. She didn't declare her identity, didn't brandish her badge, didn't demand respect. Instead, she moved to the far side of the lounge entrance, lowering herself into an empty chair. The champagne had dried stiff against her sleeve, the faint sour scent lingering. She didn't brush it off. She didn't request assistance. She simply sat, perfectly still, her posture regal despite the humiliation. Michael followed reluctantly, taking the seat beside her, his body tense with frustration. "You sent the signal. Why aren't you moving? Why not end this now?" Naomi turned her head slightly, her eyes calm, almost distant. "Because endings are easy. I want them to feel the weight of what they've done. Not now, not yet. Let them believe they've won." Michael's fists unclenched and clenched again, the rhythm of a man barely containing his fury. "You're letting them laugh. They think the silence is theirs," Naomi said softly. "But it belongs to me." Across the lounge, Robert's laughter spiked as he leaned toward another passenger, recounting the moment the champagne had spilled. His hand gestured extravagantly, mimicking the motion, his audience chuckling obediently. Taylor hovered by the counter, stealing glances at Naomi with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he had enforced order. The audience watching Naomi's story unfold, the unseen millions who would one day hear it, would feel the same fury Michael carried now. Why isn't she fighting back? Why isn't she striking? The expectation of a fiery rebuttal, a dramatic reveal, hung heavy in the air. But Naomi let the tension sag. She let the energy dissipate, let the humiliation stretch further, deeper. The dramatic explosion the crowd awaited did not come. The minutes ticked by. The fizz of champagne glasses, the rustle of newspapers, the quiet hum of business calls filled the space where outrage should have burned. Naomi sat still, her phone silent in her bag, her eyes steady on nothing in particular. The power of her presence was not in action, but in restraint. For those watching closely, the emotional arc plummeted. The audience who had been leaning forward, waiting for Naomi to strike back, were pulled downward instead. Disappointment, despair, the aching frustration of injustice unchecked. Robert thrived on it. He raised his glass again, toasting his companions. This is what happens when people forget their place. Standards matter. Tradition matters. Without them, what are we? Taylor chuckled politely, though a bead of sweat glistened at his temple. He had seen the badge. He had felt that flicker of fear. And yet he clung to his role, doubling down on his denial. Naomi, meanwhile, let her hand rest lightly on her lap, fingers steady, her face unreadable. Inside, her thoughts moved like precise gears, each click measured, deliberate. Every insult, every laugh, every second of delay was another tally on a ledger she would one day balance. Michael shifted again, unable to bear the stillness. "You're letting them believe they've broken you." Naomi's eyes softened, the faintest glimmer of something almost like amusement in them. "Michael," she said quietly, "don't confuse silence with surrender." The line dropped into the air like a stone into still water, its ripples invisible to everyone but him. To the onlookers, Naomi was nothing more than a woman subdued, too embarrassed to fight, too powerless to act. The humiliation lingered, its bitterness spreading, and that was exactly what she wanted. Because while the audience expected a burst of fire, Naomi was teaching them something far crueler, anticipation with no release, a storm withheld, a blade still sheathed. When the time came, the strike would not just shock them, it would devastate. But for now, Naomi Carter sat in silence, her suit stiff with champagne, her phone heavy with the weight of a single sent message. The countdown ticked on, unseen, unstoppable, and the world around her remained blissfully ignorant. The lounge buzzed with its usual surface calm. Polished glass, soft jazz humming through hidden speakers, champagne flutes clinking faintly. But beneath that veneer, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, like a draft creeping through sealed windows. Most passengers didn't notice, but Naomi did. She always noticed. The first sign came from the far end of the concourse. Two uniformed security officers paused outside Gate 26B. They weren't rushing, weren't running, but their posture was wrong. Their voices dropped low as they leaned into their radios, one hand pressing against an earpiece, the other resting near the baton at his side. Naomi's eyes flicked to their belts, not just standard gear. One of them had a communication patch reserved for federal liaison units. Michael noticed it too. His body stiffened beside her. "They've picked up the signal," he whispered. Naomi didn't answer. Her gaze swept the concourse. Beyond the glass walls of the lounge, a man in a dark suit strode quickly past, phone pressed to his ear. His badge was clipped inside his jacket, the faint flash of government insignia catching the light before disappearing again. Moments later, another figure hurried in the opposite direction, whispering urgently into her headset. The movements were discreet. The average traveler might mistake them for airline staff. But Naomi recognized the choreography instantly. Pieces were moving. Inside the lounge, however, the performance remained unchanged. Robert Harrington reclined with his champagne, smirking as if the world orbited around his arrogance. Taylor Brooks, the manager, adjusted his vest and continued fussing with paperwork behind the counter, though his eyes flicked toward Naomi every few seconds. She was still sitting silently, back straight, face serene. To the room, she was an outsider pretending to belong, still unwelcome despite her persistence. The audience of her story, the invisible watchers beyond the fourth wall, could feel the tension mounting. The champagne stain on her suit had dried stiff, yet she hadn't moved to clean it. The text she had sent minutes earlier still hovered like a phantom above the scene. "It's happening. Stand by." But nothing had happened. Not yet. And that was the brilliance. Michael leaned closer, his frustration audible in the hiss of his whisper. "Naomi, the whole terminal is stirring. What are you waiting for?" Her eyes softened, but her voice remained calm. "I want them to dig deeper. The longer they believe I'm powerless, the harder their fall will be." The minutes dragged. The ordinary rhythm of the lounge ticked forward. A flight announcement echoed faintly from the concourse, the automated voice a stark contrast to the quiet storm building unseen. Then came the twist, so small, so easily missed, yet heavy with implication. A flight attendant stepped into the lounge, her uniform crisp, her hair pinned neatly. She carried a tablet against her hip, the screen glowing faintly. Her eyes swept the room, pausing on Naomi with a flicker too quick for most to register. She crossed to the corner, pretending to adjust the seating chart on her device. But Naomi's gaze caught the reflection in the glass behind her. The attendant's fingers weren't pulling up schedules. They were typing, fast, urgent. Her lips moved slightly, as though rehearsing the words she sent. Naomi leaned back, her mind sharpening. The attendant glanced around once more before sliding the tablet against her side. Naomi's sharp eyes caught a single line on the screen before it disappeared. "Something big is happening. This person is not ordinary." Michael didn't see it, but Naomi did. She breathed out slowly, almost a smile curving at her lips. Someone inside the system had recognized her. Not fully, not publicly, but enough to trigger alarm. The whisper was spreading, and whispers had power. The mood of the lounge shifted without most realizing it. A couple by the window paused mid-conversation, their eyes darting toward Naomi with faint curiosity. A businessman in the corner lowered his newspaper, studying her longer than politeness allowed. Even Robert, for all his arrogance, had begun watching her more frequently between his jokes, unease flickering at the edges of his smirk. The irony hung heavy. The more they insisted she didn't belong, the more the atmosphere betrayed the possibility that she did. Taylor Brooks adjusted his tie again, the nervous tick betraying his slipping confidence. His words from earlier, "We must keep the standard," sounded hollower now in the growing undercurrent of suspicion. Michael leaned close again. "It's spreading. They're talking. Even the staff." "Good," Naomi murmured. The emotional rhythm pulled tight around her story. Viewers expecting confrontation found only silence. Those anticipating an explosion were dragged instead into anticipation's valley. What is she waiting for? Why isn't she revealing herself? And then came the second sign. One of the security officers outside the lounge whispered into his radio again, his tone sharper now. A higher-ranking airport operations manager appeared at his side, her heels clicking fast against the marble floor. She carried a binder under one arm and wore the strained look of someone rushing to prevent a crisis from breaking into daylight. She passed the lounge without entering, her eyes sweeping the interior. For a heartbeat, they met Naomi's. The woman froze mid-step, recognition flashing across her face before she forced herself forward again, walking faster, jaw tight. Naomi didn't move. She didn't need to. The wave was building beneath the surface. But inside the lounge, the insults remained. Robert raised his glass again, his voice pitched just high enough. "I do hope the airline keeps its standards intact. Imagine what happens if just anyone strolls in here. The value would collapse. Taylor chuckled obligingly, though his eyes betrayed the nerves running beneath. Michael exhaled sharply. They're still mocking you, Naomi. They don't see it. They don't know who you are. That's the point, Naomi said softly. Her voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only certainty. The tension was unbearable for those watching. The audience expected the crescendo, the strike, the revelation. But Naomi allowed the rhythm to sink lower instead, dragging emotions into frustration, into despair. She sat there, humiliated, dismissed, champagne-stained, yet utterly composed as the unseen storm gathered around her. Every whisper in the radios, every hurried step of management, every secret text from a flight attendant, all of it built a network of tremors beneath the polished surface of the lounge. And while the crowd mocked her, while Robert basked in his cruelty, while Taylor enforced his hollow standards, Naomi Carter sat still, silent, sovereign in her restraint. Because she knew what they didn't. The wave was already moving, and when it broke, none of them would be ready. The lounge air was stagnant with arrogance. Robert Harrington had grown bolder, his laughter echoing across the polished glass walls. Taylor Brooks busied himself with faux paperwork, pretending not to notice the sideways glances Naomi had begun to draw. The champagne stain on her sleeve had dried into a stiff reminder of the insult, and still she sat, poised, her silence a fortress no one could breach. Then the door slid open. A tall figure stepped inside, his crisp navy uniform immediately commanding attention. The stripes on his shoulders, the golden wings pinned to his chest. He was unmistakably a captain. Conversations faltered. A hush rolled across the lounge as passengers instinctively straightened in their seats. Authority had entered. Captain Richard Hayes scanned the room with the seasoned eyes of someone who had spent decades navigating storms both in the sky and in people. His gaze flicked past the passengers, past Robert's smug grin, past Taylor's stiff posture. Then it landed on Naomi and froze. His eyes widened in recognition, shock breaking through the calm mask of a professional. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. "Dr. Carter?" he blurted, his voice carrying clear across the lounge. Every head turned. Naomi did not move. Captain Hayes took a step forward, disbelief and awe colliding in his expression. "It's you! His voice broke with urgency, louder than he intended. "You saved my nephew's life!" The lounge turned to stone. Robert's champagne glass paused mid-air. Taylor's tie adjustment froze halfway. Passengers who had chuckled only moments before sat rigid, their eyes snapping back and forth between Naomi and the captain as though trying to reconcile two realities. Michael's lips curved into the faintest smirk, though he said nothing. Naomi, however, remained still. Her expression was unreadable, her voice calm. "Captain Hayes," she said softly, acknowledging him with the barest nod. But Hayes wasn't done. He crossed the floor with purposeful strides, his composure unraveling into gratitude so raw it cracked the room's polished facade. 3 years ago, he said, his words tumbling out. "My nephew was barely 8. Car accident. The doctors said there was no hope, but you..." He gestured with his hand, almost shaking. "You refused to give up. Hours in that operating room, steady as stone. You brought him back to us. If not for you, he wouldn't be alive today." The silence was suffocating. Passengers who had sneered now stared wide-eyed. The badge Naomi had dropped earlier, the whispers, the strange unease. Suddenly, they aligned. The woman they had dismissed as an imposter was no ordinary traveler. Robert's smirk slipped into something brittle. His hand gripped the stem of his champagne glass too tightly, the confidence draining from his posture. Taylor Brooks's face paled. He cleared his throat, fumbling with the papers on the counter, as if he could bury his mistake beneath a pile of meaningless documents. The audience, those invisible witnesses following Naomi's story, felt the surge of satisfaction. After humiliation, after silence, after restraint, here was the crack of justice. A man of stature, a captain of authority, had recognized Naomi not as an outsider, but as the savior she truly was. It was vindication, and it was public. Captain Hayes turned, addressing the room as if compelled to share the truth. "This woman," he said firmly, pointing toward Naomi, "is not just a passenger. She is Dr. Naomi Carter, the reason my family still has my nephew today. The reason that boy gets to run and laugh. And his voice thickened, raw with emotion. "You owe her your respect. We all do." The lounge exhaled, stunned. Whispers erupted in pockets. "Dr. Carter?" one man murmured. "The neurosurgeon." Another leaned close to his companion. "Isn't she the biotech CEO? I read an article." Recognition spread like wildfire. The name Naomi Carter igniting memories. Articles in journals, features in magazines, headlines about the youngest CEO in medical technology. Naomi sat still, her calm unshaken, as if she had known this moment was inevitable. For the first time, Robert Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier words, "People like her lower the value of this lounge," now hung in the air like poison, impossible to take back. Taylor Brooks swallowed hard, his palms sweating against the paperwork. He forced a smile, though it trembled. "Dr. Carter, of course," had I realized. But the damage was done. The audience's hearts soared. This was justice. This was the long-awaited recognition. The woman they had watched endure silence, humiliation, scorn, had finally been named for what she was. Extraordinary. Yet Naomi gave them no victory cry, no triumphant speech. She simply inclined her head toward the captain, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I only did my job," she said. The humility cut deeper than pride ever could. Captain Hayes shook his head firmly. "No, you did more than a job. You gave us hope when there was none. My family owes you everything." The weight of his words lingered, pressing against the glass walls of the lounge. Passengers shifted, shame crawling across their faces. Some lowered their eyes, others stared openly, regret painted in their expressions. The tide of the room had turned. Naomi remained silent. She allowed the moment to stretch, her stillness heavier than any declaration, and the audience felt it. The righteous burn of satisfaction, the thrill of justice served. The vindication after the valley of humiliation. For the first time since she stepped into the lounge, Naomi Carter was no longer the outsider. She was the axis around which the room turned. The atmosphere in the lounge had shifted completely. Where moments earlier Naomi Carter had been mocked and dismissed, now the air was charged with awe. Captain Richard Hayes stood tall beside her, his words ringing in the ears of every passenger. "She saved my nephew's life." The whispers had grown louder, names and achievements attaching themselves to Naomi like sparks to dry tinder. It felt, for the audience watching, like justice had finally arrived. The humiliation she endured was being reversed, and respect, long overdue, was blooming in the room. Then the door slid open again. A man entered, flanked by two assistants in tailored suits. His presence was immediate, the kind that drew attention even without introduction. His hair was perfectly combed, his suit a precise cut of charcoal gray, his steps confident without rushing. A badge clipped discreetly to his belt identified him as Charles Whitman, CEO of the Metropolitan Airport Authority. The room shifted again. Passengers straightened, recognizing authority even higher than the captain. Taylor Brooks almost sagged in relief, as though salvation had arrived in the form of his superior. Robert Harrington smirked faintly, sensing the power dynamic recalibrate. Whitman's eyes swept the lounge before settling on Naomi. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps even respect. But it was gone before anyone could be sure. He cleared his throat and spoke with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to owning the narrative. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice calm, deliberately lowered to carry authority. "Please understand, What happened here is not personal. It is about our rules, our standards. This has nothing to do with race." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Captain Hayes stiffened, his jaw tightening. Michael exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." Whitman continued, his tone silky, rehearsed. "Our staff follow procedures as outlined. If mistakes were made, they were procedural, not discriminatory. I must ask that we not turn this into a political issue." The passengers, who had just begun to shift toward guilt and respect, faltered. Some nodded faintly, their shame conveniently softened by Whitman's carefully crafted excuse. Others avoided Naomi's eyes altogether, relieved to let the narrative twist back to one of misunderstanding rather than malice. Taylor Brooks visibly relaxed, straightening behind the counter. His earlier fear ebbed, replaced by smug satisfaction. His superior had not only protected him, but framed the entire debacle as mere bureaucracy. Robert Harrington's grin crept back, triumphant once again. Naomi sat still, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. But for the audience, the unseen millions following her story, the emotional whiplash was brutal. Just as justice had seemed secure, just as the vindication had begun to bloom, it was snatched away. The humiliation had returned, sharper than before. Whitman clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slightly as though delivering a lecture. "Dr. Carter, your reputation precedes you. We admire your accomplishments deeply, but surely you understand that rules are rules. Exceptions cannot be made without undermining the integrity of the system. If our staff were strict, it was in service of fairness, not exclusion." The hypocrisy was a knife twisting deeper. Fairness? Integrity? The passengers had seen with their own eyes the sneers, the spilled champagne, the cruel remarks. But Whitman's measured tone reframed it all, washing the cruelty into something sanitized, procedural. Naomi's silence now took on a new weight. To some, it was dignity. To others, it was proof she had overstepped. The whispers shifted again. Was this really about race? Or was she exaggerating? The doubt spread like smoke. Michael leaned closer, his voice tight with fury. "They're painting you as the problem, as if you brought this on yourself." Naomi's hands rested calmly in her lap. Her voice when it came, was soft, even. "Let them." The audience reeled. This was the valley, the plunge into rage. After the high of vindication, the drop was devastating. To watch Naomi recognized and then dismissed again was unbearable. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his voice sharp with indignation. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitman, I was here. I saw what happened. This wasn't about procedure. This was about humiliation, about arrogance. Dr. Carter deserves an apology." Whitman raised a hand, the gesture smooth but firm. "Captain Hayes, I respect your position, but I must ask you to remain within your lane. Piloting aircraft is your domain. Policy enforcement is ours." The rebuke landed hard. The captain's face flushed, but he said nothing more. Robert Harrington chuckled softly, swirling his champagne. "See, rules are rules. Even heroes must learn their place." The venom in his words drew scattered nods, reluctant but real. The crowd, once on the edge of solidarity with Naomi, drifted back toward complacency, comforted by the CEO's narrative. Michael's fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles whitened. "Naomi, this is madness. You don't have to endure this. One word, just one, and they'll regret every second." But Naomi's silence remained. Her calm was maddening even to her allies, but it was deliberate. She had seen this pattern too many times before, systems protecting themselves, authority cloaking cruelty in policy, power shielding arrogance from consequence. She knew better than to fight here, in this moment, on their stage. The passengers shifted uneasily, caught between two truths: the undeniable injustice they had witnessed, and the convenient absolution Whitman offered. And so, Naomi Carter remained once more the outsider, branded not as victim or hero, but as a potential troublemaker, a disruption to be contained rather than a voice to be heard. The arc of emotion for the unseen audience plunged, from triumph to fury, from vindication to despair. Naomi sat, regal in silence, her eyes calm even as the walls of denial closed around her. And deep within she knew, the lower they pushed her, the higher the reckoning would rise. The sting of Charles Whitman's words still lingered in the lounge like smoke after a fire. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to read newspapers or sip champagne, but their eyes betrayed their unease. Captain Hayes stood rigid, jaw clenched, unable to believe what had just unfolded. Michael sat at Naomi's side, fists tight, his anger barely contained. And Naomi? She smiled. It wasn't wide, wasn't dramatic, just the faint curve of lips, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not looking closely. Michael saw it though, and his confusion deepened. "Naomi," he whispered, "why are you smiling? They've just humiliated you again." Her response was a calm, almost playful murmur. "Because they've mistaken silence for weakness, and they always do." Without another word, Naomi slipped her hand into her bag and drew out the black, unbranded phone once more. She rose slowly from her seat, as if stretching her legs, then stepped toward a quiet corner of the lounge where shadows pooled beneath a tall planter of artificial bamboo. Her fingers danced across the screen, selecting a secure line. She lifted the phone to her ear, speaking softly, almost conversationally. No one else could hear the words, not even Michael. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Naomi said very little, a name, a code, a location. Then she ended the call, slid the phone back into her bag, and returned to her seat as if nothing had happened. Michael leaned toward her urgently. "What did you just do?" Naomi only gave that same calm smile. "You'll see." Minutes ticked by. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. Robert Harrington poured himself another glass of champagne, regaining some of his smug composure. Taylor Brooks busied himself with a tablet, checking manifests he barely comprehended. Charles Whitman continued pacing near the counter, his assistants whispering updates into his ear. Then the first phone rang. It was one of the assistants, her sleek device vibrating violently in her hand. She frowned, answered quickly, and froze. Her eyes darted to Whitman, panic flickering across her expression. Before Whitman could react, the second assistant's phone buzzed. He answered, paled, and nearly dropped it. "Sir," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's the Department of Defense." The words cut through the air like a blade. Conversations in the lounge faltered again. Whitman frowned, grabbing the phone himself. He pressed it to his ear, and within seconds, his face drained of color. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "What do you mean detained? Who authorized?" He stopped, listening, his hands trembling. No, this is a misunderstanding. She's just a passenger." His words trailed off into silence. Michael's eyes widened, realization dawning. "Naomi, what did you—" He didn't finish, because at that moment, a news alert flashed across the digital screens mounted in the lounge. The scrolling ticker, usually reserved for weather updates and flight delays, carried a breaking headline. "Department of Defense partner detained at airport, internal investigation underway." The room froze. Passengers gasped. Some pulled out their own phones, scrolling feverishly to confirm what they were seeing. Whispers rippled across the lounge, words tumbling out in shock. "Department of Defense? Partner? Who? Here?" Taylor Brooks's face turned gray. He looked from the screen to Naomi, then back again, as though the walls of his carefully constructed reality were collapsing around him. Robert Harrington sputtered, nearly spilling his drink. This can't be real. It's just a coincidence." But his voice shook, betraying his disbelief. Whitman slammed the phone down onto the counter, his composure shattered. He barked orders to his assistants, his voice cracking. "Find out who released this! Shut it down, now!" But it was too late. The headline was already spreading, carried by countless devices across the airport. The system was unraveling, and Naomi had lifted not a finger in the room. Passengers who had mocked her earlier now stared with wide eyes, suspicion twisting into fear. The badge, the whispers, the captain's recognition. It all converged into one undeniable conclusion. Naomi Carter was not someone to be dismissed. Michael leaned in, his voice low, almost reverent. "You didn't even raise your voice. And yet," he gestured toward the chaos unraveling around them, "the entire system is crumbling." Naomi's smile returned, faint but razor sharp. "Power doesn't always announce itself, Michael. Sometimes it just whispers, and the world listens." The tension in the lounge cracked wide open. Security officers outside the glass doors were now moving quickly, radios pressed tight to their mouths. Senior managers hurried past, their faces strained with panic, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The wave had broken. Passengers who had laughed minutes before now looked at Naomi with open fear. A woman who had sneered earlier whispered urgently to her husband, "She's not ordinary. She's dangerous." And that was the twist. Naomi didn't need to argue. She didn't need to fight for respect. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone in that lounge. With a single, quiet call, she had shifted the axis of the entire airport. The humiliation they had forced on her now seemed absurd, petty, laughable, in the face of the storm her silence had unleashed. And yet she remained seated, perfectly composed, as though none of it touched her. The audience watching her story unfold felt the whiplash again, from despair to awe, from fury to vindication. Naomi Carter had not just endured. She had turned their arrogance against them, letting the system collapse under the weight of its own denial. She didn't need to say a word. The airport was already on its knees. The airport was unraveling. What began as whispers now surged into open chaos. Radios crackled frantically, uniformed officers rushed across the concourse, and managers barked contradictory orders into their headsets. Naomi Carter sat silently in the lounge, her poise unbroken, her champagne-stained sleeve now resembling less an insult and more a mark of quiet defiance. Then came the announcement. A stern voice echoed across the intercom. "All Diamond Elite Lounge personnel, please report immediately to Terminal Command. Compliance is mandatory." The lounge froze. Taylor Brooks's hand trembled, his papers scattering to the floor. Robert Harrington's champagne glass slipped slightly, a drop splashing onto his tailored suit. Passengers exchanged anxious glances. No one had ever heard an order like that before. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers entered the lounge. Their posture was stiff, their expressions grim. One of them pointed directly at Taylor and Robert. "You two, step forward." The arrogance that had once animated Robert drained in an instant. His face went pale, his smirk vanished. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, rising reluctantly to his feet. "I'm a Diamond member. I've flown more miles than—" "Step forward," the officer repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Taylor Brooks swallowed hard, his face ashen. He tried to protest, but his words died when the officer's hand touched the baton at his belt. With hesitant steps, Taylor moved from behind the counter, standing beside Robert in full view of the lounge. The humiliation was immediate. Passengers who had joined in Robert's laughter earlier now whispered behind their hands, their eyes wide with fascination and fear. The predators had become prey. Naomi watched in silence, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Then the doors opened again, and the atmosphere shifted once more. A man entered, flanked by aides, and trailed by a camera crew hastily setting up behind him. His suit was immaculate, his stride purposeful. His face was familiar to many. Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Atlantic Airways, one of the most powerful airline executives in the world. The room seemed to hold its breath. Pierce's eyes scanned the scene. The cowering Taylor, the trembling Robert, the unsettled passengers, and finally, Naomi. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something heavier: guilt. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out, practiced but trembling at the edges. "Dr. Carter." He paused, forcing the words through a throat that had rarely spoken them. "On behalf of Atlantic Airways and this airport, I extend our deepest apologies." Gasps rippled through the lounge. Passengers leaned forward, unable to believe what they were witnessing. A CEO, one of the most powerful men in aviation, was bowing his head to the woman they had humiliated minutes earlier. Pierce continued, his tone heavy with rehearsed sincerity. "The treatment you endured here today was unacceptable. It does not reflect our values, our mission, or our respect for our most valued partners. I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff." He turned toward Taylor Brooks and Robert Harrington, his gaze hardening. "And those responsible will face consequences." Taylor's knees buckled, his voice cracked. "Sir, I was only following procedures." Pierce cut him off sharply. "Procedures do not include humiliation. Procedures do not include arrogance. You have disgraced this company and this airport. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending formal review." Taylor's face collapsed. He staggered slightly, clutching at air as though drowning. Robert tried to step forward, his voice trembling with desperation. "This is absurd! I am a Harrington. My family—" Pierce's eyes burned cold. "Your family name does not excuse cruelty, Mr. Harrington. You will leave this lounge immediately. Your membership privileges are revoked, effective today." The color drained from Robert's face. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. The passengers erupted in whispers. Shock, awe, and a flicker of satisfaction swirled together. The very people who had laughed at Naomi now watched the scales tip violently in her favor. Justice had come, not whispered this time, but shouted for all to hear. Pierce turned back to Naomi, his voice softening, though it still carried the weight of the cameras now filming every word. "Dr. Carter, we cannot undo what was done, but we can assure you this. Atlantic Airways and this airport will make amends. You have our deepest respect." The audience, the invisible millions watching her story unfold, felt the rush of vindication crest. This was the peak, the crescendo. The humiliation Naomi had endured was now reversed in the most public, undeniable way possible. Michael leaned slightly toward her, his whisper taut with awe. "They're on their knees, Naomi. Every last one of them." But Naomi did not gloat. She did not smile. She only inclined her head faintly, her voice calm, steady, regal. "Respect isn't words, Mr. Pierce. It's actions. I'll wait for yours." The simplicity of the line cut sharper than any declaration. The cameras caught it. The passengers absorbed it. The internet, already ablaze with headlines, would seize it. And in that moment, Naomi Carter stood not just as a wronged passenger, not just as a CEO or a doctor, but as the embodiment of quiet, unyielding power. The humiliation had been transformed into history. The lounge, once a stage for her disgrace, had become the theater of her triumph. And the audience reveled in it. Their hearts soared, their anger finally released into satisfaction. Naomi had not only endured, she had conquered. The Diamond Elite Lounge was no longer the polished sanctuary it had once appeared to be. Its marble floors and glass walls felt more like a courtroom now, and all eyes were fixed on Naomi Carter. Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Atlantic Airways, had already bowed his head in apology. Robert Harrington had been stripped of his membership, and Taylor Brooks was suspended on the spot. The audience, the passengers present, and the millions who would later watch this moment unfold across news feeds expected Naomi to deliver the final blow. Retribution, the dramatic crushing of her enemies. The catharsis of humiliation reversed. But Naomi did something no one expected. She stood. Her presence was magnetic. Her champagne-stained suit now less a mark of shame and more a banner of resilience. She moved with calm authority to the center of the lounge, facing the very people who had mocked her. Mr. Pierce, she said, her voice clear but steady. You offered me apologies. Apologies are easy, but I don't need your easy words. I need change. Pierce straightened, uneasy. Dr. Carter, I assure you we will take corrective measures. These individuals will be— Naomi raised a hand, silencing him. No, you will not make them scapegoats. The room gasped. Taylor Brooks's head snapped up, disbelief flooding his face. Robert Harrington blinked rapidly, unsure if he'd misheard. Even Michael leaned toward her, confused. Naomi, you're letting them go? Her eyes didn't leave Pierce's. I don't want them fired. I don't want them discarded. I want them confronted with their own actions, their own biases. Let them look the world in the eye and admit what they did. The tension in the room thickened. Pierce hesitated. That could be complicated. Public relations, Naomi cut in sharply, is why this industry has hidden behind polished glass walls for decades. It's why arrogance thrives. If you want change, it begins here, today. Her demand was impossible to deny. The authority in her voice left no room for debate. Within minutes, arrangements were made. A podium was rolled in, cameras adjusted, and the very employees who had humiliated Naomi, Taylor Brooks, the lounge staff, and even Robert Harrington, were positioned before the watching passengers. Naomi stood opposite them, regal in her silence, waiting. The first to break was Taylor. His voice cracked as he spoke into the microphone, his words shaky, desperate. I judged Dr. Carter by her appearance. I assumed her presence here was a mistake. I enforced rules that weren't about fairness, but about exclusion. And for that, I am ashamed. Gasps rippled through the room. One by one, others followed. A lounge attendant admitted to mocking Naomi's documents. Another confessed to looking the other way when Robert had spilled champagne on her. The shame was palpable, thick in the air. Finally, Robert Harrington stepped forward, his face pale, his voice trembling. I said things I should never have said. Cruel things, racist things. I believed my wealth and my name gave me the right to look down on others. I was wrong. His voice broke, and for once there was no arrogance, only fear. I humiliated someone far greater than myself, and I humiliated this lounge. The audience erupted, not with applause, but with stunned silence. The confessions were raw, undeniable. Naomi's face remained calm, but her words carried the weight of centuries of struggle. What you've admitted today isn't just about me. It's about every traveler you've dismissed, every voice you've silenced, every human being you've diminished because they didn't look like you, sound like you, or carry your wealth. This isn't my humiliation, it's the industry's. Her words struck like thunder. Pierce looked stricken, his polished facade crumbling. Dr. Carter, what do you want us to do? Naomi turned to him, her eyes sharp but steady. You will create a mandatory accountability program across this airport, and every airport you oversee. You will not fire these people to save face. You will educate them, reform them, put them before the very passengers they once judged, and let them serve with humility. The passengers murmured, stunned. This was not vengeance. This was transformation. Michael leaned close, whispering urgently. Naomi, people wanted you to destroy them, to tear them down. She answered softly, without hesitation. Revenge ends a story. Reform begins a movement. The unseen audience, the millions who would replay these words again and again, felt the twist slam into their hearts. They had braced for blood, for fire, for retribution. Instead, Naomi offered something harder, something deeper, mercy sharpened into justice. Pierce nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of inevitability. It will be done, effective immediately. Naomi inclined her head, her voice steady. Then today marks the beginning of change. Not for me, but for everyone who ever walked into a lounge and was told they didn't belong. The crowd exhaled as one. For the passengers watching in real time, for the millions who would later see the footage online, it was not just a moment of justice. It was the seed of revolution. Naomi Carter had not just survived humiliation. She had turned it into a blueprint for reform, a mirror the entire industry could not look away from. And the audience felt it. Awe, respect, hope. The arc of emotion had twisted again, not into vengeance, but into something far more enduring. The humiliation was over. The reckoning had begun. 1 year later, the world looked different. The Diamond Elite Lounge still gleamed with marble floors and polished glass, but the energy inside had changed. No longer a fortress of exclusion, it had become a symbol of transformation. At every Atlantic Airways terminal across the United States, the same quiet revolution had taken root. They called it the Carter Protocol. Born from a single moment of humiliation, it had become the new standard for American aviation. Every staff member, from ticket counters to pilots, had been retrained under its banner. The rules were simple, but profound. Transparency in treatment, accountability for bias, and the unshakable principle that respect was not a privilege purchased with wealth, but a right granted to every human being. For passengers, the difference was palpable. Complaints of discrimination had plummeted. Trust had risen. The very spaces once whispered about as elitist barriers now carried an unspoken weight. If you worked here, you treated people with dignity, or you didn't work here at all. And at the heart of it, though she never demanded credit, was Naomi Carter. This day, she walked through the familiar sliding glass doors of Atlanta International Airport, not as a CEO, not as a hidden passenger traveling under her mother's name, but as herself. No cameras followed, no aides trailed behind. She wore a simple black coat, a leather carry-on slung across her shoulder, her presence unmarked except by those who knew. What struck her most was not the silence of exclusion, but the absence of spectacle. The clerk at check-in greeted her warmly, neither groveling nor doubting, simply processing her ticket with professional grace. The TSA officers nodded politely, no overreach, no suspicion. Inside the terminal, passengers bustled past without stares of judgment or recognition. For the first time in years, Naomi Carter moved through an airport like any other traveler. Equal, ordinary, human. And yet, there were echoes of her story everywhere. Posters on the walls displayed the Carter Protocol Charter, short statements of respect and fairness in bold, visible fonts. Staff wore badges indicating their training. Screens reminded passengers of their rights and encouraged reporting of misconduct without fear of dismissal. Naomi's lips curved faintly as she passed one of those posters. Her name wasn't on it, but the meaning was undeniable. When she entered the lounge, it was almost surreal. The space that had once tried to expel her now opened its doors without hesitation. The receptionist smiled and scanned her pass. No hesitation, no whispered doubts. Inside, the air was calm, not of arrogance, but of quiet professionalism. And then came the moment that stopped her in her tracks. By the far window, a young girl sat with her mother, clutching a stuffed bear. The girl's skin was dark like Naomi's, her hair pulled into neat braids. Her wide eyes followed Naomi as she walked by. She tugged her mother's sleeve urgently, whispering at first, then louder, "Mom, that's her. That's the woman who changed the rules." The mother glanced over, recognition dawning. She smiled softly at Naomi, not with awe, not with fawning reverence, but with gratitude. A nod, a silent thank you. The girl, however, was unrestrained. She stood on her chair, pointing openly, her voice bright with wonder. "That's her!" Naomi paused. She met the child's gaze and smiled, just slightly. No words passed between them, but the exchange was louder than any applause. The child's eyes sparkled as though she had glimpsed a hero. And in that moment, Naomi felt the true weight of her story. Not in the CEOs brought low, not in the headlines that blazed her name, but in the quiet hope she had planted in a new generation. Around them, the lounge carried on. Passengers ordered drinks. Staff moved efficiently. Flights were announced. Naomi took a seat in the corner, blending in like anyone else. And that was the beauty of it. She had not fought for special treatment. She had not demanded thrones or crowns. She had fought so that a woman like her could sit quietly in this room without being questioned, diminished, or expelled. The cameras that once captured her humiliation and vindication were gone. The spectacle was over. All that remained was the change. As her boarding call echoed through the speakers, Naomi rose, collected her bag, and walked toward the gate. Her footsteps were steady, unhurried. Heads turned, some in recognition, most in respect, but none in mockery. At the threshold of the jet bridge, she paused for a moment. She glanced back, not at the people, not at the marble and glass, but at the memory of what had been. 1 year ago, this space had sought to erase her. Now, it bore her imprint forever. She smiled faintly, then stepped forward, disappearing into the plane. The story did not end with thunder or applause or revenge. It ended in silence, the silence of equality achieved, of justice no longer needing to shout. For the millions who had followed her journey, the emotions lingered. Pride swelled. Tears burned. Hope flickered. Naomi Carter had become more than a CEO, more than a doctor, more than a woman humiliated and redeemed. She had become a symbol, a living proof that dignity could be demanded without rage, that justice could be achieved without vengeance, that change could come not from destruction but from reform. And so the Carter Protocol lived on, not in headlines, but in the daily dignity of every traveler who walked through those gates. For the little girl who had pointed with wonder, for the mother who had nodded with gratitude, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Naomi Carter had changed the rules, and the silence she left behind was more powerful than any roar.